this is session 5, and what I'd like to do is just go through again where we've been and where we're headed this session and our last session together. So from session topics, we've covered a lot of historical patterns, and not only in the first session, but elsewhere, we've seen competing narratives focusing on different events, whether it's in the 1948 milestone or the 67 milestone or the Intifada's. Then we talked about religion and focused a lot here with regard to landlessness as part of the Jewish identity or Israel's identity, and then receiving land, and then that land being basically, or being displaced from that. We also got into life in Palestine and the seesaw or balancing act of safety and security versus freedom and dignity. And just again, we'll probably repeat it a couple times, but Bishop Yunan's quote, Israel's security is dependent upon Palestinian freedom, and Palestinian freedom is dependent on Israel's security. So that leads us, and certainly violence, the theme derailing and complicating so much of what objectives are out there from a justice standpoint and peaceful resolution. So now we're going to, this evening, talk about Christian presence. And actually, that's the main theme for tonight, or this session, but then also we're going to be talking about activism next session as the major focus. But these sort of bleed together. And on the Christian presence, we're going to take a couple quick detours. When we talk about Christian presence and we compare them, we're going to take a little bit of a detour into the aspect of religion in Israel from a Judaism standpoint in terms of religious Jews. And then we're also going to talk into, we're going to have some personal testimony basically from the Christian Zionist perspective in terms of perhaps the largest group organized in the United States. Okay, so the three questions we have for this evening are, why is the Christian population proportion dwindling? What are Christian church leaders doing in terms of community support, and what key messages does Christianity provide in the midst of the conflict? So first of all, just some background. This is all from a fairly recent study by Pew Research Center, and we've talked about this before. Depending on the statistics you garner about Israel as the country Israel, what you find is it's anywhere in terms of Jewish background from anywhere from between 75 and 80%. And here in this study, they report 81%. And then the non-Jewish is 19%, whereby the overwhelming majority of that is Muslim. Druze, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, 2%. Druze are interesting. They're Arabic, but they're not Islamic. And they have actually a very close relationship to Israel. Druze are probably, I think, the only non-Jewish ethnic group that are allowed to be part of the military. And in many instances where they'll have a celebration about Zionism or Israel's history, they'll have Druze, because they appear Arab, they'll have Druze as part of that saying, look, here's an example of how we're a democratic society, because we have a minority, an Arab minority that's very much aligned with us. And then you have Christian, only about 2%. So even though it's made up a little bit differently, it's about the same percent of Christians in Israel or the West Bank and Gaza. In Gaza and the West Bank, it's about 2% as well. So the Pew Research study found that the vast majority of Christians identify ethnically as Arab. And that gets back to what we talked about in the very beginning. It's because of where their families are from, in what we called the older historical Palestine term. Majority agree with Muslims that Israel cannot be a Jewish state and a democracy at the same time. They tend to be less religious than Israeli Muslims, but more religious than Israeli Jews. And we'll get back to that statement in a few minutes. But basically, what they're basically saying here is the overwhelming majority of Muslims are religious practicing. I've come across, and so did the Denners, they're secular Muslims as well, but they're not as prevalent as secular Muslims are not as prevalent as secular Christians or secular Jews. Christians have limited family and social connections with Jews or Muslims. So what we find culturally, even in Jerusalem, and now the funny thing is too, there's even ethnocentric views within those cultures in terms of more conservative Jews are in their own neighborhoods, worship, not only worship, but go to certain universities, study, socialize. And so you have all these different circles even within the Jewish culture. Muslims, somewhat maybe, but not so much because they're all Sunni Muslims. They're all of the same type of following of Islam. And then Christians are probably the more open group among. But then the interesting thing is Jews, Christians, and Muslims, they might work together. They might actually live in the same neighborhood, but they don't socialize. And part of that, I don't think is necessary. I mean, it turns into something about communication and natural affinity for each other. But what you have in all three of these cultures is a very a strong family and actually patriarchal family kind of identity. And so if you're going to do something socially, you're doing it with your entire extended family or part of your extended family. You're not going out necessarily with friends as much. Now, there's exceptions to that, but for the most part, you can actually have good working relationships across Jewish, Muslim, and Christians. But it sort of is, that's what happens between, on the work shift, but then you're back with your family. The other interesting statistic is of the Christians, 94% have been baptized. So, and here's an interesting anecdote. One of our training courses, we had a woman come in to help us learn how to ask where the bathroom was in Arabic and stuff like that. Some very basic things. And she went around, and one of the things in terms of introductory phrases, she went up to a young guy from Finland who's an agnostic or an atheist. And they were role playing, and she said, "Are you Christian?" And he said, "No." So then she asked in Arabic, "Are you Jewish?" And he said, "No." And then he says, "Well, then you must be Muslim." And he said, "No." And so she stopped and said, "Well, we're role playing here, and you're from the West Bank. You have to be one of the three." And he says, "Well, I'm not Christian." And so she just made the point, well, you got to be one of the three from an ethnic standpoint. And that's what you answered from the ethnic standpoint. This is what, when you ask somebody if they're Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, that is not a faith-based question in Israel or the West Bank. They're Jewish, they might be secular or not. So here's the next slide. So this was a study done by, it was published by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. It came out of another group actually did the study, and it's not a most recent study. But I don't think if it's changed, it's probably gone more secular, if anything. So here are the questions they asked of Israeli Jews. To what extent do you believe or not believe in each of the following? There is a God. Believe completely. 2/3, or a little less than 2/3, 63%, strongly believe that. Supreme power guiding the world, a little less, 57%. Torah given to Moses on Mount Sinai, a little more than half, slightly more than half. The Jewish people were chosen among peoples. Half, 1 out of 2, agree with that. The Torah and mitzvot are God's commands, a little less than half again. And then the coming of the Messiah, less than 40%. There is a next world, 35%. This is really not abnormal. There is a next world. I mean, and this is not a scientific study, but my personal interaction with people who are Jewish people over the years is most American Jews do not believe in an afterlife. And so this is probably indicative of that. But I think we get into this aspect when we hear the word Jewish from an American perspective or a Jewish state. We're assuming that's, at times maybe we're not, but we're assuming that's a religious aspect of that term. It brings, and certainly for a number of people it does, but there's a sizable portion of the Israeli population that it does not. Okay, so when the study said the Christians are more religious than the Jews, but less religious than the Muslims following Islam, they're higher than this. I don't know what. I mean, by nature of who I interacted with, I would say it was probably like 80%, but I could be wrong because the people I interact with over there who are Christian are part of communities of faith. I met a few people that were Christian that were clearly not, that were secular Christians in conversations, but there weren't that many.
So when Americans are pro-Israel, do they understand that it's not necessarily a religious Israel that's working over there all the time?
Well, I think it's the same over here as it is over there. I think there are people who are pro-Israel who could very well be secular from a faith standpoint because Israel's the only democracy over there in their mindset, or the Israel, funding military their military budget that we fund over there is like $30 billion a year. They are our test case in many instances to new technology. We benefit from a military perspective. We benefit from that. So I think there's all sorts of people that are people of faith not so much, and then secular folks that in the United States are backing Israel for all different reasons.
You may have already mentioned this. Back to your pie chart. What was the percentage that actually practiced Judaism?
Well, I mean, what you'll have, this is where you'll get culturally aspect too. You'll have higher percentage than this that say they go to Passover, they follow the holidays, so they'll list all the holidays, and then they ask them about whether they practice mitzvah or the Shabbat, etc. So Shabbat is going to service every Saturday, and so like back here in the United States, if you ask Christians if they go to church every Sunday, is that a litmus test about their faith or their practices? So you'll find culturally, we have cultural Christians, and this is not a disparaging comment, that, they might go on Christmas and Easter, they'll go to baptisms, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll find a lot higher percentage of people that saying, yeah, I observe Passover, Yom Kippur, et cetera. So then it's like, is this cultural or is this? So these questions of belief, those are all part of the survey, but these questions of belief seem to get a little bit more focus on whether they believe in God. Do you believe in God? Yes. No. Whatever. Okay? Good question. Okay. So, just got done saying 2% in Israel, 2% in the West Bank. If you go to Jerusalem, it's much higher than 2%. Frankly, I don't know what the percentage is, but there's a cluster of Christians in Jerusalem, particularly in East Jerusalem. Bethlehem in the West Bank is the largest cluster of Christians, and now it's at 12%. But 70 years, or 1950, it was 86%. So what's happened? That's a pretty sizable drop in 66 years. Because it's 3 generations or whatever. Now it goes to to 12. Well, part of it is, now the funny thing about the proportions, you know, I'm a statistician, but so I know how to manipulate data. So, and this is what Israel, I shouldn't say that. There's two ways of looking at this. It's dropped proportionately, but the same number, frankly, in Bethlehem, I think the number is something a little less than 60,000. The number hasn't changed. 66 years ago, it was 60,000. So there's the same number of Christians, but so how did the proportion, well, if it's not the numerator, it's the denominator, right? So what you have are, it's been a sizable or substantial influx of Muslims into the West Bank. So here's the economic aspect of a couple things. The Muslims are under occupation as well. But Bethlehem is a pretty thriving city in terms of tourism, etc. And relatively speaking, it's not necessarily Jerusalem, but you go into parts of Bethlehem and you think you're an international city. It's pretty nice. It's surrounded by the wall, and there's some parts that are very, very impoverished. But if you stay close to the old city, Manger Square, pretty nice. The influx of Muslims is twofold. Number one is Muslim families tend to be larger. Most Muslim families have quite a few children. Not too different than many conservative Jewish families in Israel who are there and in the settlements as well. They have large families. Christian families are more like American family sizes. You know, many people you meet over there have had 1 to 3 children is sort of the range. If they had 4 or 5, they would be outliers as Christians in Bethlehem. The other aspect is home mortgages and financing. In the West Bank, it's pretty tough to, and the prices, the land is very, very expensive. Unless you have inherited the land, it's probably next to impossible to afford purchasing the land. And you buy, many people are buying condominiums and living in condominiums there in Bethlehem. However, for Muslims, there's financing. You have private organizations in a variety of other Arab countries that provide financing for Muslims to purchase real estate. Not the same thing for Christians. So you have actually some level of, envy or tension between certain Christians about, been living here my whole life, working a couple, 3 jobs, struggling to make ends meet, and a guy who I went to school with got this backing and reimbursement to buy this nice property. So the financing mechanism creates an environment for Muslims to move in. Muslims have larger families, and therefore we have a dwindling proportion of Christians in Bethlehem. So other aspects, not unlike others, and we'll hear this in a little bit, other minority groups, Israeli Christians are treated as second-class citizens, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The closures and restrictions to holy sites. We saw that Bethlehem checkpoint 300. A lot of prominent Christians just can't get into Israel. So they have family and even wanting to go, they just find the restrictions dispiriting. Lack of international awareness that they exist. Missed a word there, they exist. This is basically why Bright Stars of Bethlehem, I didn't mention this, but are sponsoring the photo exhibit. They and have photos of Palestinian artists. They want people to know that they exist. They want people to know that there's a Christian community over there trying to provide hope and support to their community, that they exist. I'm not sure how surprised you are, but there's still a giant opportunity in the United States here just to have people become aware that there are Palestinian Christians in the West Bank. And then the occupation theologies, that would be their term, and Christian Zionism. So with that, let's go, and this is going to be something you can observe, and I'm interested in your response or reaction to it. Broad diversity of people of faith. I'd say the core aspect of this that you take away is the operating assumption is the current state of Israel is God's fulfillment of his covenant with Abraham. Does that equate to be that fervent or that excited? It's Israel today is still the Israel of or Abraham's descendants. The purpose of showing it now is think about you being Palestinian Christian living in Bethlehem and wondering whether, I'm assuming some of these people that we just saw know that there are Christians living there, but I'm not sure. But at times, you might find if you talk to others who are not very aware of this or have heard one aspect of it. We've heard Mitri say this while he was here a few years back, and I've heard it when I'm talking to folks as well. People think the Christians over there were converted probably by European Christians or American missionaries going back over there. Some missionary aspect versus that they were there in some aspects since the first Pentecost, which again gets into this aspect of, does anybody know we exist? Does anybody even care? Okay. So we're going to hear from a few folks, from their personal views about what, and we're going to go with Dina first. She actually she's an Israeli citizen, and her husband heads up the Nazareth Bible College. So Dina's from, as you heard, Israel. We're going to go right into another video of Bishop Yunan, who lives in Jerusalem. A couple takeaways there. Obviously, both Christians, one in Israel and one in Jerusalem. He happens to live actually in Bethlehem, but he's able to travel back and forth. One thing that we haven't talked about was the perspective here that if we solve the Israel-Palestine conflict, as complicated as it is, what the ramifications or what the blessings might be worldwide with other conflicts. The value of doing this not just for the justice for the people experiencing injustice or oppression in West Bank and Gaza. And the other aspect is there's never cheap justice. We might try to cut corners and think that we're compromising, but there's a cost to justice. And then the aspect of another takeaway was the church is the conscience of the government. If we see a government out of line, community of faith, believers can bring that to light, shine that to light. Other comments or takeaways, other questions about that, either from Dina or Bishop Yunan? Okay. Jean, I met Jean. She is the leader, she's in a Friends community, Quaker community. They don't really have leaders, but she's pretty much the leader of the Friends community. And Jean's rather refreshing. I'm going to show you another YouTube. This is a very brief one. I had the pleasure of not only being in a Friends worship service with her, or a Friends meeting, I guess what you would call, but then actually had lunch with her. And she's sort of like Dina in terms of seeing that even in her own community, the Christian community, there's a patriarchy aspect that has limited her as and so I think that's one of the reasons why she chose to become a Quaker. But a marvelous woman in terms of a woman of faith and perspective. So this is only, I think, a 2-minute video or so. She talks about hope. You know, another core aspect of Jean's message is hope, at least for me personally. When I hear the word hope, I used to think of it as some sort of passive thing and saying, okay, well, I just have to hope harder, but what did that mean? Pray harder, pray more. It's sort of like a head thing to me. It was something between my ears, hope. But what we hear from her is something, very active, equating it with faith without works. You just can't sit in a corner and hold your breath hoping and something's going to magically change, right? She said if you want equal rights, you have to work for equal rights. And so, again, I think the hope being a very active, not an intellectual or a mind thing, but every aspect of your being in terms of acting in a hopeful way is a blessing or a concept that I saw. I mean, I saw hope not just from Jean, this description, but that same consistent view, and frankly, not only with Christians, but with Muslims. So even though Christians are only 2% of the population in the West Bank, it's amazing, I think, I might have a vested view, a biased view being Christian, but it's amazing the impact the Christian community there as well as worldwide has on the West Bank. About 1/3 of the healthcare facilities are Christian-sponsored facilities. And again, let me also say this. There are a number of denominations involved here, but the Lutheran World Federation and the ELCA are very, very much engaged in all aspects of this. 45% of the non-governmental organizations, so this would be various aid societies, community service groups, are church-related or funded. When we say funded, it would be international organizations that are Christian-based organizations. There are other secular organizations that make up the other 55%, but 45% are Christian-affiliated. Even though there are 2% of the population, 10 mayors across the West Bank are Christian. And 2 Palestinian National Authority ministers under President Abbas are Christian. And I think he has about over a dozen, maybe it's closer to even 20, but still it's a lot more than 2%. Yes. Evangelical Lutheran Church, just a little bit more of a deep dive here. So there are congregations located in Jerusalem and then in the West Bank, Bethlehem. Bet Jala is basically a suburb. It's contiguous to the Bethlehem. Beth Sha'ar, Ramallah, and also in Jordan, Amman, Jordan. Lutheran Church is heavily engaged with refugees in Jordan, Syrian refugees. There's 4 schools that teach Muslim and Christians together in Palestine. Muslims make up about 1 to 3/4 of the students, depending on the school. The school employs nearly 200 educators, full and part-time, as well as other staff, and nearly all faculty and staff are Palestinian, some of whom would be Muslim and some of whom would be Christian. Related to the Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem is Dayar Consortium. Under the Dayar Consortium, you have the Dar al-Kalima University that is sponsoring the photo exhibit. We just heard Nora. This is very recent. It's less than a year old. The World Council of Churches put together these personal testimonies. It's called the 12 Faces of Hope. So what you have are a number of people who are either Israeli citizens or live in Palestine. Most of these individuals are Christian, but there are some Jewish perspectives here as well. And we're going to hear from a rabbi that I met and had the pleasure of talking to is a rabbi with a Reformed
when we look
Jewish
for hope, it is
congregation.
not so.
And in discussions, she feels there are a number of rabbis that are getting more, I guess, vocal within Israel. And we had a conversation about like Martin Luther King and also Gandhi, because there are people who are saying that currently Israel is losing their soul in terms of trying to justify the political position and minimizing or ignoring their community of faith call to assist the alien, etc., welcome the alien. So we had conversations about where she feels or has hope with regard to prophets from her own people, religious rabbis speaking to this. Now, unfortunately, they haven't gotten much of a voice yet, but they're pursuing that. Okay. Comments or other reactions about Noah? Okay, lastly, what I just wanted, and obviously those talks get into activism, and we'll be talking a lot more about activism next week. But a couple things I wanted to recommend as it relates to, again, this Christian presence, and not only in Palestine and Israel, but Christian presence over here. A couple websites that I have found very, very valuable. Perhaps my most favorite website is the Palestine Portal Community. Okay. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on the website, but this website is a wealth of information and even has it tailored in terms of navigating the website based on possibly a category of interest and whether or not you're clergy campus minister, church advocacy committee, study group, activist, individual looking for answers, university seminary faculty. So obviously for all of that, they have a lot of resources. They even get into action alerts and upcoming trips that one can consider. And there are a number of denominations that are supporting this website. So there's and again, you can get it pretty much on any topic. You could go in here for a deep dive and find some level of information. There might be a link to other websites, but it's probably the most comprehensive website and keeps fairly current. It might not be like the most current in terms of current events, but current in terms of information on any kind of topic. Peace Not Walls is the ELC website. And what you have here is things that sometimes are specific to Lutheran Assembly actions, but a lot of other information. I'm actually involved with this website in terms of advisory capacity, and we're updating some content. I'm working on the Christian presence content. But there's blogs as well as advocacy alerts. Most of you are probably familiar with advocacy alerts through ELCA, but there are some things here specific to Israel-Palestine. And then lastly, the other website, I won't go to it, I'll just speak to it, is the Bright Stars of Bethlehem. So this is a good website. It is specifically around Mitri Rahab and Dayar Consortium. It's all about his work and their needs and aspects, but nonetheless very good. And they are very engaged within the United States and Germany, and not just with Lutheran congregations. I mean, he happens to be a Lutheran minister, but Presbyterians, Episcopals, United Church for Christ. I mean, but a very engaging leader. Committed his life to providing community services in the West Bank on behalf of providing hope in the midst of the occupation. Any closing questions or comments? Okay, for those of you who can make it, next week will be our last session, and we'll pick up sort of where we're leaving off here. We're talking about activism, and we'll pick that up. And we'll be speaking of activism as it relates to Israeli activism that's pro-Palestinian, along with Palestinian activism and some activism in this country and others. Okay? Thanks a lot.